So of course I'm here to talk about startups, but I'm not just here to talk about startups. I'm here to talk about a special type of startup phenomena, something that we at Accelerace has dubbed the Startup Tsunami. And the idea of the Startup Tsunami is best illustrated with a story. But before I tell this story, I'm going to give you a small warning, because this story it's terrifying, it's tragic, but it's also strangely fascinating. And it's really important because it gives us a template for understanding innovation and entrepreneurship. The story takes place on that cursed day of the 11th. Not September 11th, but March 11, 2011. It is 2:46 p.m. local Tokyo time, and the busy people of Japan are in the midst of the workday, when suddenly the ground starts shaking. Just a little bit, but then more and more intensely. Now, to most of us living here in Scandinavia, that would be sort of an odd feeling. But to people of Japan, it was familiar. They knew that Japan was being hit by an earthquake. But the thing is, Japan is used to earthquakes. All the infrastructure has been built to absorb the shocks. So in the end, even though this earthquake turned out to be the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japanese history, measuring above 9.0 on the Richter scale, almost all the buildings were left intact. And most people were left unscathed. So what happened was that people came out from underneath the desk where they've been hiding, from outside their basement, and they felt relief. The earthquake had surpassed, and the day could move on. Except that 60 minutes later, we would all learn in absolute horror that this earthquake was indeed no ordinary earthquake. Because about 270 kilometers outside the coast, about 30 kilometers down at the seabed, the same tectonic plates that had caused the earthquake had also triggered a tsunami. Now, at the time, no one knew this. But the tsunami had been traveling underwater with the speed of a commercial jet. And when it hit the coast, it rose up to a wave of biblical proportions. A mountain of water measuring 30 meters hit the Japanese coast with such a force that it kept moving inland for 10 kilometers. And it absolutely demolished everything in its path. In the aftermath of this earthquake, people were desperate to learn whether their loved ones were safe. It was midday in Japan. People's spouse, husband, wife were at work, children at the kindergarten. So everyone took out their phone immediately and tried to call one another, tried to text one another. But when they took out their phone, it was dead. Because the water had also taken down the cell phone towers. So the phones had no connection. So what people did was they fled to these small towns where they could still get some interconnection on internet cafes, and they went online, and they went on email programs, they went on chat forums, and they sent chain mails and tried to learn whether their loved ones were safe. The thing was, the internet at the time wasn't really built for that purpose, and it didn't really work. And people were lining up, and they were desperate, they were crying. It was terrible. A group of developers saw that situation and quickly responded. They built a little app built to help of the tsunami, and they called it Line. Line was released just a couple of months after the earthquake to help people connect. And it did. People signed up and they connected and they chatted and they talked and they shared pictures. And Line became an instant success in Japan. But the fascinating part of this story is not Line. It is what Line did. Because Line inspired other entrepreneurs all over the world to create chat apps. So in 2011, the year Japan was hit by an earthquake and a tsunami, we also saw a different type of tsunami. We saw a tsunami of chat apps. And these would hit the global telco industry just a few years later and would completely reshape that industry as well. At the time, no one really paid attention because all of these looked like toys. It wasn't really until a few years later the world understood what was in the making. It happened when the big Japanese e-commerce giant Rakuten acquired Viber, one of these chat apps, for $1 billion. $1 billion. How can a little chat app with no revenue model be worth $1 billion? Well, if you were amazed in 2014, you would become even more amazed a couple of years later when Line goes public and is valued at $9 billion. 1 year after that, Snapchat goes public on $33 billion. And today, the last part, or the last one of these chat apps, WeChat, we don't know its exact valuation. It is the main asset of internet giant Tencent in China, which surpassed Facebook's valuation last year. The main asset is WeChat. Anyone knowing China knows that you cannot live in China, you cannot do anything in China without actually using WeChat. It is probably worth close to the $500 billion. It's easy sort of to look at the telcos today and say, ha ha ha, you got disrupted, you slipped by the wheel. The thing is that what we tend to forget is that telcos at the time had been driving a lot of innovation, as they always had for decades, and a lot of really smart people were working at telcos. The thing is that it wasn't so much a problem with the telcos, it is a problem about startup tsunamis. A startup tsunami is a special phenomenon when a large part of startups is triggered by a technological earthquake. And just like a normal tsunami, a startup tsunami is also invisible. To most people, it is utterly invisible until it suddenly rises. Until in 2014, Rakuten drops $1 billion for Viber. It is invisible because all of these things look like toys. They're indistinguishable from other startups. They exist with accelerators, co-working spaces, in basements. They're not having the grandstand on the Web Summit or even here, maybe. The thing is that these startup tsunamis, they are developing over time. It takes about 7 to 10 years for a startup to mature from founding to exit, roughly. It spans widely, of course. And many of the startups we know today as huge successes were founded a long time ago. So take the cohort right now that's going public, the Spotifys, the Airbnbs, the Dropbox, they were all from 2007, all from that cohort. But believe me, back in 2007, these things looked like a toy. The 2012 cohort of startups counts companies like Coinbase, Instacart. Most people know those as well, if you follow tech. But if we go a little forward in time, 2014, some of the big winners probably, maybe, are going to company like Skydio or Shift. How many of you know that? Not very many. And if you go to 2017, 2018, that's the big question. What are the startups right now that are being launched that's going to change our world in the next 6, 7, 8 years? Maybe even before that. The question is there a new startup tsunami coming? And my argument is there will be, and this is the reason. Startup tsunamis are caused by technological earthquakes and the underlying industrial platform. Any business is built on a technological platform where you have to produce something, you have to transport whatever you produce to someone, and you have to communicate with your customers internally and with your partners. Every business is built up on these technological layers. Sometimes something happens in those layers that is disruptive enough, a big enough change, so sometimes it happens in multiple parts of these layers, that the industrial platform doesn't merge. A new industrial platform is built in parallel. It's a parallel industry. It happened, of course, most famously around the Industrial Revolution, when we had changes in all three layers of the infrastructure basically at the same time. Steam engine enabled us to produce. Trains enabled us to transport whatever we produced much faster. The alternatives were horses. The telegraph as well it allowed us to communicate instantly. Again, we came from a horse. When you have convergence of those technological layers, you see a massive amount of startups being built upon these because the new infrastructure allows for companies to be built much, much cheaper, much, much more powerful than on the earth and the old infrastructure. When you look back in history, this becomes really evident. So I don't think that this is a coincidence. If you go back, just like cars, the combustion engine changed fundamental production of cars, and that is why 3 of the biggest car companies today were launched within 3 years of each other. The microchip, personal computer, 70s, 3 companies launched within 3 years of each other. The sharing economy, 2000s, biggest companies launched within a few years after each other, and obviously the chat apps. These were all results of a much bigger startup tsunami. I think that we've had startup tsunamis in the past, obviously, but I think that those that are going to hit us in the future is going to be much, much bigger. The reason for that are these facts. Number one, the number of startups keeps increasing. We just see it at TechBBQ. It becomes bigger every year. If you take proxies, one of our competitors, YC, in the Silicon Valley, many of you will know them, their number of applicants rose from 2007 around a couple of hundred a year. That was the Dropbox and the Airbnb. Out of that tiny portion, Airbnb and Dropbox were founded. But today, they are having applications of north of 15,000 per year. From 100 to 50,000 a year in 10 years' time span. They have so many applicants that now they are launching a startup school, accelerating 15,000 companies by now, a year. The second reason, or that is the same reason, but we see the startups being given, is originating from other places in Silicon Valley. They no longer have they don't have monopoly in startups. We've seen the biggest startup campus in the world being opened in Paris last year. It just shows that startups are emerging from every major city in the world today. More than the number of startups, the funding they attract is exploding. In the same period of time, we saw a doubling in startups. We've seen a 4x in the amount of funding. And that's just traditional venture funding. Just an example of this. This bike company, Ofo, if you've ever been to China, you've seen tons of yellow bicycles. They raised $2.2 billion since they were founded in December 2015. $2.2 billion. For those of you who work in a corporate, you used to have at least economic muscles that could overpower the startups. You had more money to do innovation projects. That's not necessarily the case anymore. What we see is also companies are finding new sources of cash. One of the most interesting of those is, of course, crowdfunding. Until some years ago, last year actually, crowdfunding was something you did for hardware projects. But cryptocurrencies has allowed software to crowdfund. We saw the beginning of that last year with $3.5 billion for ICO mechanism into startups. This year, that was surpassed alone in the first quarter. We don't know where we're going to end this year. but we're probably going to end north of 10, maybe $15 billion. One of the examples here, Bancor famously raised a lot of money. It's not the amount, it's the time. It took them 3 hours to raise this amount of money. The world's so far largest ICO has been EOS with $4 billion, a lot of institutional funding going through those. So it's not just venture funding, it is new funding as well. And it's all propelling the tsunami of startups coming. So I am here to say that from what I can see, what I can observe, we are going to be hit by a severe amount of startups coming in and hitting us this year, next year, and so on. The thing is, going back to some of the disruptors and changes of the underlying industrial platform, we see blockchain as one of those really, really big changes. And it's literally an earthquake underneath the industrial platform. It's innovation in the production layer, and you can now produce decentralized applications with inbuilt trust, inbuilt payment mechanism, much cheaper, much faster than you could on the traditional industrial platform. Where we are now with blockchain, I don't know, I think we're around 1994. We have around 2,000 dApps built on the Ethereum ecosystem right now. If you go back on the internet, that's equivalent to 1994 when we crossed 2,000 websites. It takes more than 2,000 potential applications to actually create something that we like. It just does. Things take time. We don't have the browsers. Very few of you have wallets. Very few have the MetaMask installed in your Chrome browser. These things take time. But when we have solved the scaling issues, this thing is going to explode and provide an incredible amount of applications that we haven't seen yet. But they're already starting to hit us. We see wearables, XR, we see voice, haptics, AI, and all different kinds of this layer. We see disruptive technological change, which will create new technological platforms, industrial platforms. Just a few examples from our batch. We had Accelerace, a new YouTube competitor out of Italy, using tokens to, instead of advertising model on the video side, to incentivize content creators. XR, really big tsunami. We're big on that on Accelerace. Yes, I know a lot of you are sort of, I thought we would all be wearing goggles by now, but these things take time. What we need is things that are untethered, lightweight. We need 200 degrees of vision, and we need something that has around the 10K or 10x the resolution that we have today to get to a really compelling experience. Those headsets exist, but they cost $10,000 right now, only in developer mode. But they exist, and that means they will hit consumer market within the next couple of years, and then the experience will be so incredible that there's no way that we are all not going to be hooked by these things. We're starting to see the early implications of that. A company such as Bolværk, a Danish really cool virtual reality startup, are training right now cabin crews in virtual reality. We see another company in our accelerator, Tommy, creating a game for children that are hospitalized. It's very traumatic for a child to be at a hospital. They give them goggles, and the whole hospital transforms into a childlike, stress-free experience. And they actually are reduced. The time they're at hospital are reduced drastically if they wear the Tommy or the Tommy application. The third one I would say is the mix of IoT and machine learning. This is big, and I know that everyone's talking about AI, so what is the problem really? The problem is really that we have a lot of data, but all that data is siloed. There's a lot of smart devices out there, but they all connect to the cloud and they have their own application, but that's generally uninteresting for very specific use cases. It's interesting. What's really interesting is if all that data were shareable, transferable, the algorithms. So that means you would have all the different data. Entrepreneurs could tap into a wide pool of data from all different kinds of sources and then mix it. It's not the AI that right now that's the strictest. It is the data, and it's the sharing, and it's the transferability of data and the rights about data. And when we have that, we'll see a flurry of really interesting AI applications. We're, of course, already seeing a lot of them coming to the surface today. One of those examples, Mishkan, is an Accelerace company from Finland doing distributed machine learning. Really cool. They can do machine learning on the edge. They don't have to suck it up in the cloud. They can do it directly on the device, which means it goes much faster Another company called Precure, you can wear, it's a wearable, it tells you by using AI if you are about to develop, before you develop, if you're about to develop some kind of injury on your movements. My point is, there's no way that you can ignore the incoming wave of startup. Of course, as investors, we don't ignore it by you know, we don't know it because that's what we live off. But we need to understand the tsunami. As corporates, you also need to understand this, because some of these things are going to change the industrial platform on which you operate. So the big question is, how do you engage a startup tsunami? And Accelerace, we have been doing this for a long, long time. But specifically around corporates, we have developed a number of best practices. I'm going to share these today. These are by no means the absolute truth. It's not going to be, you know, do these things and then you'll succeed, because this is a new field. And it's a new field. We can see that the history of working with innovation in big corporates have been approximately a journey like this. In the 1900s, we had the R&D labs. The basic idea was we can invent everything ourselves. We have the smartest people, and they did. So places like Xerox Labs, 3M Labs, Bell Labs, they created much of the innovation that we're all enjoying today. The thing was, it turns out they were less good at commercializing it. Those who actually made money of many of these things were the venture capitalists. Most famously, of course, Apple taking the personal computer or the graphic interface out of Xerox PARC, commercializing, making a hell of a lot of money. The corporates then thought, maybe we can also be a venture capitalist, so we'll take some money out of our balance sheet and we'll create a corporate venture fund and we'll start investing. Some companies are still doing that today, some corporates, and many of them are good at it. But to a large extent, this experiment failed, to a large extent. Then what corporate did was the next wave, and we've been through that wave. It is that corporate thought, we see all the startup movements, we can also work like a startup. So why don't we put our innovation teams in places like Rainmaking Loft, all the cool work, Founders House and so on. We teach them to do agile, we teach them to do lean, all of these things. Maybe we can also innovate in the same pace as startups. And they can, and they're good at it, and it's something they should continue to do, just doesn't scale. When you're faced with a constantly growing number of startups working on whatever you are also working on, at some point you will lose. You can still do it, and I think you should do that around things that are close to your core. Things a little further out, there's no other way than to start facing this tsunami and start working with startups. So the new idea is startup engagement. How can we partner with startups? It's a very new concept. Very few corporates are doing it right now as a core innovation strategy, but we see a lot of companies that have started doing it. And some of the early learnings from that is what I'm going to share right now. First, you need to understand the tsunami. There's no other way to do that than get your hands dirty. You can't just subscribe to CB Insight, print out a report, and sort of like that's probably what's going to happen in the future. Because if they're here, they're too late. You can't also just go to Web Summit and walk around. Because like I said, many of these startups, I bet you Snapchat did not have a stand at the Web Summit. There's no other way than truly understanding the ecosystem. And that is people like you coming from abroad, coming here, getting your hands dirty, walking around, talking to co-working space accelerators like us, the early angels. There's no other way than to do it, to really get a good grasp. So hire a number of venture scouts, we call them venture scout and Accelerace, place them all over the world and have them as an input source. Of course, you still need the CB Insights and so on, but here you get first-hand data. Do that. If you can't do that or don't want to do that, buy it from someone who has that venture scout network. The second thing I would say is you have to invite the startups to collaborate. I've seen so many of these corporate entrepreneurial projects or these accelerators open up and no one's really showing up. I think a lot of corporates have that problem because their brand is simply not a startup brand. You have to ensure deal flow. I don't have the magic key for deal flow, but one of those things is you definitely have to show sincere interest. We worked with a number of corporates that did show sincere interest, and we could get the startups. One was Enel in Italy, big utility provider. A third of those companies are today doing pilots with Enel because they truly wanted to work with these startups, not a branding exercise. In La Telecom, in Riga, we're also doing the same thing. The third thing I would say, lay rails into the organization. I think we also learned that in a hard way. I mean, startups and corporates have a great match if they have operational synergies, some kind of operational synergies. There's no way to achieve that without actually connecting your business units to this. Cannot just be innovation, have actual business units be a part of this. That's very, very important. The last thing I would say, and that is something that is that some of you will experience once you actually start engaging the startups. Startups are, of course, as you know, killed by corporate structure. But on the other hand, you can't just let them float, because at some point someone will say, cut that thing off. You have to create an integration space, a sort of integration accelerator, where you can run these companies for a while, and you can start pilot testing your technology, your integrations, but also your culture around these things, and then actually find the right way to integrate once all these proof points has been made. If you can do that as a corporate, you have gained something that potentially could develop as a new competitive advantage, being able to utilize an external innovation to work for you. That was about the Startup Tsunami. Thank you.